Former federal judge Harold Bennett, 85, thought retirement meant peace. One morning in Charleston, he was walking down a new street and stumbled into an upscale neighborhood. Despite being lost, he remained calm and was stopped, questioned, and arrested for suspicious conduct. In court, the presiding judge recognized him as a legendary former judge. The charges were dismissed and the officers were ordered to apologize. Justice went with him that day. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where are you watching from today. And if you believe in changing racial prejudice, this story is for you. Charleston, South Carolina woke gently under a pale wash of coastal light. The air carried a faint salt breeze drifting in from the harbor, and Spanish moss hung like quiet gray ribbons from old oak trees. It was early enough that traffic had not yet begun its daily argument with the streets. The city felt suspended between night and morning. A fragile, peaceful pause. Harold Bennett had always loved that hour. At 85, he still rose before sunrise without an alarm. Discipline had been the architecture of his life. He lived alone in a modest wooden house on the edge of the city, where Charleston's historic charm gave way to quieter residential streets. The house was simple. Pale blue shutters, a narrow porch, and a small garden he tended with patient hands. Harold himself was a tall man for his generation, standing just over 6 feet even now, though age had slightly thinned his once broader frame. His skin, deep brown and weathered with fine lines, told the story of decades spent both under courtroom lights and beneath a southern sun. His silver-gray hair was cropped close, neat as ever. His eyes, dark, steady, observant, had the unsettling calm of someone who had listened to every form of excuse a human being could invent. He moved with deliberate grace. Not fast, not fragile. Controlled. For more than 50 years, Harold had exercised every morning. Push-ups in his youth. Long runs in his 40s. Brisk walks and light resistance training in retirement. He believed the body, like the law, must be maintained or it would betray you. On the kitchen counter rested a framed photograph of a younger Harold in a black judicial robe. Former federal judge Harold Bennett. For nearly 4 decades, he had presided over complex civil rights cases, corporate fraud trials, and constitutional disputes. Lawyers had described him as strict but fair. Defendants had feared his clarity. Law students had studied his opinions. He retired 10 years ago, not because his mind had dimmed, but because he believed institutions should outlive individuals. Since then, his life had become quiet. He read history in the afternoons, tended roses in the evening, and once a week, he volunteered at a local community center teaching constitutional basics to underprivileged high school students. That was where Maya Thompson first met him. But this morning, Harold was alone. He tied his worn gray sneakers and stepped outside. Dew still clung to the grass. Birds stitched the silence with soft chirps. He began walking his usual path toward the Ashley River, a route he could trace blindfolded. Yet halfway there, he slowed. A thought, small and almost playful, entered his mind. Change the route. He paused at the corner, considering the unfamiliar direction to his right, a stretch of road that led toward a newer development called West Haven. Just a little variation, he murmured to himself. Harold was not reckless, but he understood something about aging. If you repeat yesterday too faithfully, you begin disappearing into it. So he turned. West Haven sat on the northern edge of Charleston, a pristine residential enclave built within the last 15 years. The streets were wide and perfectly curved. The sidewalks clean, lawns cut with geometric precision, white fences framed identical homes painted in soft creams and muted grays. From a distance, it looked like order. Up close, it felt like repetition. Harold noticed the uniformity almost immediately. Each mailbox stood at the same height, each porch light matched. Even the trees had been planted in symmetrical rows. He walked steadily at first, enjoying the smooth pavement. The quiet here was different. Not the organic quiet of early morning Charleston, but a manufactured silence. No children's bikes on lawns, no elderly couples reading newspapers on porches, no signs of ordinary life spilling outward. After 15 minutes, he realized he hadn't seen a single pedestrian. He turned left, then right, then another left. The streets curved in loops that gently folded back into themselves. Each intersection looked like the previous one. Harold checked his watch. Only 25 minutes had passed. Yet he no longer recognized the direction of the river. He did not panic. Panic was inefficient. Instead, he slowed his breathing and tried to reconstruct his path logically. The sun was rising behind him. That gave him east. He adjusted his direction, but another curve swallowed the horizon. For the first time that morning, he felt the subtle disorientation of being outside familiar geometry. Across town, Maya Thompson stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of her navy blazer. Maya was 23 years old, tall and lean, with warm brown skin and expressive almond-shaped eyes that revealed her emotions before her voice did. Her natural black hair was pulled into a neat low bun. She carried herself with both ambition and caution, the cautious confidence of someone who had grown up watching her parents navigate subtle barriers with careful dignity. Her father had once told her, "You'll have to be twice as prepared to be heard half as much." That sentence shaped her life. Maya was beginning her first internship at the Charleston County Courthouse. She had earned it through relentless study and quiet resilience. On her desk lay a worn copy of constitutional case law. Inside it, tucked carefully, was an old article about Judge Harold Bennett. She had met him at a community lecture 2 years earlier. He had spoken softly, without theatrics, about the responsibility of power. "Justice," he had said, "is not loud, it is consistent." She had never forgotten that. This morning, she felt nervous, but proud. She did not know that the man who inspired her was walking into a situation that would test the very principle he had taught. Back in West Haven, Harold paused at an intersection where 3 identical streets met. A patrol car rolled slowly into view. The vehicle was clean, polished. It moved not urgently, but attentively. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped out first. Daniel was 28 years old, tall, athletic, and sharp-featured. His blond hair was trimmed short beneath his cap. His posture was rigid, the posture of someone eager to prove himself. He had graduated near the top of his academy class and believed strongly in order. But beneath that belief was insecurity. He had grown up in a household where mistakes were punished harshly, and he had learned to equate control with safety. To Daniel, unpredictability signaled danger. He approached Harold with measured caution. "Morning, sir. Everything all right?" Harold turned calmly. "Yes, officer. Just walking." Daniel glanced down the street behind Harold. "Do you live in this neighborhood?" "No." A second officer stepped out of the passenger side. Stephen Cole was 35, broader in build, with dark brown hair and tired eyes. Unlike Daniel, Stephen carried quiet fatigue rather than tension. He had spent 10 years on the force and had seen enough to understand that situations could escalate quickly, sometimes unnecessarily. He was not cruel, but he was cautious. Stephen observed Harold carefully. "You lost?" Stephen asked. "It appears I may be," Harold replied evenly. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "This is private residential property. We've had reports of unfamiliar individuals walking around." Harold nodded once. "Walking is still permitted under the Constitution, I believe." Daniel studied him again. Tall, elderly, composed. Something about the calm unsettled him. "Do you have ID?" Harold hesitated for a fraction of a second, not in guilt, but in principle. He had spent his career defending the idea that citizens should not have to justify their presence in public space without cause. "I have identification," he said carefully, "but may I ask what specific law I am suspected of violating?" The question was respectful, but to Daniel it felt like resistance. Stephen shifted his weight subtly, sensing tension. The morning, once gentle and quiet, seemed to tighten like a wire, and in that narrowing silence, with Spanish moss swaying far beyond the manicured perfection of West Haven, Harold Bennett stood at the edge of a moment that would not remain small. Harold Bennett understood he was lost long before he admitted it to himself. The symmetry of West Haven was not accidental. It was engineered precision. White houses with identical shutters lined both sides of the street. The maple trees were planted at mathematically equal intervals, their branches trimmed to the same rounded silhouette. Even the mailboxes stood like disciplined soldiers, painted the same soft gray. He had walked in 2 large arcs already. The sun had climbed higher, and the coastal humidity began pressing gently against his skin. A thin line of sweat formed beneath the collar of his light cotton shirt. It was not fear that quickened his pulse, only the subtle frustration of a mind accustomed to order confronting manufactured disorientation. He slowed near an intersection where 3 streets branched outward in soft curves. The air felt strangely insulated, as if the neighborhood absorbed sound. No barking dogs, no lawnmowers, no visible residents. Then the low hum of engines disrupted the stillness. 2 patrol cars approached from opposite ends of the street and slowed almost simultaneously. The choreography was efficient, practiced. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped out first, boots firm against the pavement. In daylight, his features appeared sharper than before. Blue eyes alert, jaw set with disciplined tension. His uniform was immaculate, creases precise, badge polished to mirror brightness. He carried himself like someone who believed vigilance was virtue. Growing up with a father who had been a firefighter killed in a warehouse blaze, Daniel had internalized a simple doctrine: hesitation costs lives. That belief, over time, had hardened into suspicion of ambiguity. Officer Stephen Cole exited more slowly from the second vehicle. He was broader, slightly taller, with olive-toned skin and dark hair beginning to thin at the temples. 10 years older than Daniel, Stephen's eyes carried a fatigue that came from too many long shifts and too many calls that blurred together. He had once dreamed of becoming a social worker before financial strain pushed him toward law enforcement. There remained in him a residual instinct to de-escalate, though habit often pulled him back into procedure. Daniel approached Harold first. "Sir, what are you doing in this neighborhood?" Harold turned with measured calm. "Walking. Do you live here?" "No?" Stephen circled slightly, not aggressively, but observantly, assessing posture, hands, body language. Harold stood upright, shoulders squared, neither submissive nor confrontational. "We've had reports of unfamiliar individuals," Daniel continued. "This is a private residential area." Harold's gaze drifted briefly toward the immaculate rows of homes. "I see sidewalks. I see public roads." Daniel's tone sharpened. "Do you have identification?" "I do," Harold replied evenly. "May I ask under what suspicion I am being detained?" The question was polite, precise. It carried the cadence of someone accustomed to courtroom language. Daniel's jaw tightened again. "You're not being detained. We're asking questions." "And I'm answering them," Harold said. A faint movement caught Stephen's attention, a curtain shifting in the second house on the left. Someone was watching. A woman stepped cautiously onto her porch several yards away. She appeared to be in her early 40s, tall and slender, with straight auburn hair falling to her shoulders. She wore fitted athleisure clothing, likely returning from an early jog. Her name, though unknown to Harold, was Claire Whitmore, a corporate attorney who had moved to West Haven seeking quiet after a contentious divorce. Years of courtroom battles had sharpened her instincts. She watched interactions carefully, analyzing tone and posture as if observing a deposition. Claire crossed her arms lightly, observing the scene without intervening. Daniel spoke again. "Sir, are you aware that residents have reported someone matching your description walking repeatedly in circles?" "I am aware that I am walking in circles," Harold answered calmly. "Because your neighborhood appears designed that way." Stephen suppressed the faintest exhale of amusement. Daniel did not. "Sir, if you don't live here, we need to verify your identity." Harold reached slowly into his pocket and retrieved his wallet. His movements were deliberate, transparent. He handed over his driver's license. Daniel studied the card. "Harold Bennett. he read aloud. The name did not register. Stephen glanced briefly at the ID, then at Harold's face. Something about the name stirred distant familiarity, though he could not place it. Daniel returned the license, but did not step back. "Why are you walking here instead of in your own neighborhood?" "Because I chose to," Harold replied. A silence stretched. Sweat traced lightly along Harold's temple, but his breathing remained steady. The sun was no longer gentle. It pressed down, reflecting off pale facades and amplifying brightness. Stephen tried a softer tone. "Sir, residents here are cautious. If you're lost, we can escort you out." "I would appreciate directions," Harold said. Daniel's eyes flicked toward the houses again. Sensing invisible witnesses, he felt the weight of expectation. Maintain control. Avoid error. "Before that," he said firmly, "we need to confirm you don't pose a threat." Harold's eyebrows lifted slightly. "On what basis would I pose one?" "Unfamiliar presence, repetitive movement, refusal to explain adequately." "I have explained," Harold answered. "I am 85 years old. I am walking. I am lost." Claire Whitmore shifted slightly on her porch, her expression tightening. She was accustomed to seeing corporate compliance disputes escalate over smaller ambiguities. Something about the exchange felt disproportionate. Across town, in the Charleston County Courthouse, Maya Thompson sat at a polished wooden desk reviewing her first assigned case file. The courthouse interior smelled faintly of old paper and polished oak. Tall windows filtered in the late morning light. Her supervising clerk, a middle-aged man named Thomas Gallagher, leaned over her desk. Gallagher was stocky, balding, with kind gray eyes behind wire-frame glasses. Once an aspiring litigator, he had settled into administrative steadiness after the stress of a failed early career case had shaken his confidence. He valued procedure and encouraged interns to observe carefully before speaking. "Focus on the details," Gallagher advised Maya. "Facts matter more than impressions." Maya nodded, absorbing every word. She had dressed conservatively. Navy blazer, cream blouse, low heels, her movements deliberate but slightly tense with first-day nerves. A murmur drifted from the intake area down the hallway. "Older male," someone whispered. "West Haven. Suspicious behavior." Maya's attention flickered momentarily but returned to her file. She did not yet know the name attached to the rumor. Back in West Haven, Daniel took a small step closer to Harold. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us." "Am I under arrest?" "Not yet," Daniel replied. Stephen added carefully, "It's just to clarify the situation." Harold looked at both officers in turn. His expression remained composed, but something subtle shifted behind his eyes, a recognition not of danger, but of implication. "For walking?" he asked quietly. "For investigation," Daniel said. A faint breeze stirred the maple leaves above them. The quiet of the neighborhood now felt less peaceful and more watchful. Harold straightened slightly. "I have complied. I have identified myself. I have requested only lawful explanation." Daniel's patience thinned. "Sir, refusal to cooperate escalates this." "I am cooperating," Harold said. Claire Whitmore stepped 1 foot forward on her porch but hesitated. She did not know the man. She did not know the lawfulness of the situation. She told herself the officers were trained. Stephen noticed her movement and felt the social pressure intensify. Daniel reached for his radio, speaking briefly in coded shorthand. The maze of identical houses stood silent, immaculate, detached. Harold Bennett, former federal judge, stood beneath that uniform symmetry, surrounded by procedure and suspicion. And for the first time that morning, the walk he had chosen out of curiosity no longer felt like a simple variation. It felt like a narrowing corridor. The patrol car doors remained open. The decision hovered in the heat. The patrol car doors remained open, sunlight glinting against the polished metal. Harold Bennett stood where he was, shoulders squared, chin level, the heat pressing against his back. Officer Daniel Brooks waited for compliance. Officer Stephen Cole watched the man's posture carefully, sensing the fragile boundary between procedure and escalation. "Sir," Daniel said more firmly now, "please step toward the vehicle." Harold did not move. His voice remained calm, almost instructional. "I have not violated any law." The sentence, simple and precise, landed heavier than it sounded. To Daniel, it felt like defiance wrapped in civility. "Refusal to comply can be interpreted as obstruction," Daniel responded, stepping closer. "I am not refusing," Harold answered. "I am questioning the legality of the request." That distinction, subtle but meaningful, only irritated Daniel further. His training emphasized control of scenes before uncertainty multiplied. He had learned that hesitation invited unpredictability. In his mind, he was preventing risk before it appeared. Stephen shifted his weight uneasily. He had seen confrontations spiral for less. He studied Harold's hands again. Steady, open, no tremor of aggression. Behind a lace curtain, Claire Whitmore still watched from her porch. She had not retreated inside. Her legal instincts told her this interaction was tilting away from proportion, but she did not yet intervene. She was cautious, shaped by years of high-stakes corporate litigation where misreading timing could cost everything. Daniel reached for Harold's forearm. The grip was not yet violent, but it was no longer conversational. "Sir, step forward." Harold's posture stiffened reflexively, not in resistance but in dignity. "There is no need for force." That word, force, triggered something sharp in Daniel's expression. Stephen moved in to assist, placing a hand lightly on Harold's other arm, intending to guide rather than restrain. But the optics had already changed. Two uniformed officers now held an 85-year-old man. "I will walk," Harold said quietly. "Release my arms." Daniel interpreted the statement as negotiation. "Hands behind your back," he ordered. Harold inhaled once, deeply. "On what charge?" Daniel's patience fractured. "Suspicious behavior and failure to comply." "That's not a statute," Harold replied. The tension snapped. Daniel twisted Harold's arm backward, not brutally, but abruptly enough to destabilize him. Stephen's grip tightened instinctively. Harold's balance faltered for a split second, though he did not fall. His spine straightened again with deliberate control. He did not shout. He did not struggle. He did not plead. He simply allowed himself to be guided forward. The metal of the patrol car door felt hot against his palm as Daniel pushed it open wider. Stephen eased Harold into the back seat, careful not to strike his head on the frame. The door shut with a solid mechanical finality. Daniel walked around to the driver's side, jaw clenched. "Let him explain it in court," he muttered. Inside the vehicle, Harold adjusted his posture upright despite the confined space. The plastic bench seat felt foreign and impersonal. Through the tinted window, he watched West Haven's symmetrical houses recede slowly as the car began moving. He did not feel fear. He felt something more complicated, disappointment layered over recognition. He had presided over cases involving unlawful detentions. He had written opinions clarifying probable cause. He knew exactly how thin the justification was. They will understand later, he thought, or they will be made to. Stephen glanced into the rearview mirror. Their eyes met briefly. There was no hostility in Harold's gaze, only an unsettling steadiness. The second patrol car followed behind. Claire Whitmore remained standing on her porch long after the vehicles disappeared from view. She crossed her arms tighter, her mind replaying the interaction. She knew enough about law to recognize the ambiguity, but she also knew how easily neighborhoods protected themselves from uncomfortable narratives. She turned slowly and went back inside, unsettled. Across town, the Charleston County Courthouse hummed with subdued weekday rhythm. Interns hurried with files. Bailiffs exchanged clipped conversations. Maya Thompson was reviewing procedural guidelines when a printed intake log slid onto her desk from the administrative tray. "New detainment from West Haven," Thomas Gallagher said, adjusting his glasses. "Unusual this early." Maya's eyes scanned automatically. Name, age, charge, her breath stalled. "Harold Bennett, For a moment, the letters blurred. She read them again, slower. Age, 85. Charge, suspicious conduct, failure to comply. Her heartbeat quickened so suddenly she felt it in her throat. It had to be another man with the same name. But Charleston was not large enough for many 85-year-old Harold Bennetts. She stood abruptly, chair scraping softly against the floor. Gallagher looked up. "Everything all right?" "Yes," she answered automatically, then corrected herself. I need to confirm something." Maya moved quickly down the corridor toward the chambers of Judge Richard Whitmore. Judge Richard Whitmore was in his early 60s, tall and lean, with neatly combed silver hair and a composed, analytical expression. His face carried faint lines carved by years of careful listening. He had once clerked under Harold Bennett decades earlier, an experience that shaped his understanding of judicial restraint. Whitmore was not impulsive. He valued order, precedent, and decorum. His clerk, a young man named Aaron Feldman, answered the chamber door. Aaron was slender, pale, and meticulous, the type who color-coded legal briefs. He had grown up in a family of public defenders and carried a quiet reverence for the court's integrity. "I need to see Judge Whitmore," Maya said, her voice tighter than usual. Aaron hesitated but read the urgency in her posture. "He's reviewing motions. It's regarding a detainee intake," she replied. Inside, Whitmore looked up from a stack of documents as Maya entered. "Yes?" She held the printed log with slightly trembling hands. "Your Honor, there's a detainee scheduled for processing from West Haven." Whitmore nodded. "That's not unusual." She swallowed. "The name is Harold Bennett." The room fell still. Whitmore's expression did not change immediately, but his eyes sharpened. "Repeat that. Harold Bennett, 85. A long pause stretched between them. Whitmore leaned back, slowly in his chair. He knew only one man by that name whose age matched. "Bring me the intake file," he said quietly. Back in the patrol car, Daniel spoke into his radio, confirming arrival time. His tone was controlled again, procedural. Stephen kept one eye on the road and one on the mirror. "He doesn't seem like a threat," he muttered. Daniel's grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "We don't wait for threats to become visible." Stephen did not respond. In the back seat, Harold folded his hands loosely in his lap. The motion was familiar, how he had rested them during long hearings. He closed his eyes briefly, not in surrender, but in reflection. He had told young lawyers for years that justice depends on vigilance. Now, vigilance had come for him. The patrol cars turned into the courthouse intake entrance. Harold opened his eyes. "Let him explain it in court," Daniel had said. Harold's lips curved faintly, not in amusement, but in quiet certainty. Yes, he thought, we will. By mid-morning, the Charleston County courtroom carried an unusual density in the air. Word had traveled quickly through clerks, deputies, and a handful of local attorneys that an elderly detainee from West Haven was being processed. The room filled faster than typical for minor charges. Lawyers postponed hallway conversations to sit quietly along the wooden benches. A few off-duty officers lingered near the back wall. Curiosity has its own gravity. Harold Bennett stood at the defense position, hands resting lightly in front of him, wrists unbound but posture unwavering. The fluorescent lighting cast faint silver across his closely cropped hair. Even without a robe, he carried himself with unmistakable authority. Shoulders squared, chin lifted just enough to suggest self-possession rather than defiance. His dark suit jacket, though modest and slightly worn at the cuffs, was neatly pressed. He had declined the public defender offered during intake, requesting instead to speak for himself. Officer Daniel Brooks stood several feet behind him, uniform crisp, expression tight but controlled. His stance was rigid, as though bracing for scrutiny. Beside him, Officer Stephen Cole shifted subtly from foot to foot, aware that the room's energy was different from an ordinary arraignment. He had testified dozens of times before, but never under this particular kind of attention. In the second row sat Claire Whitmore, the West Haven resident who had observed the initial interaction. She had come quietly, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that mirrored her professional precision. Claire was not prone to impulsive activism. She preferred evidence to emotion. But something in the morning's events had unsettled her sense of proportion. She sat upright, auburn hair tucked neatly behind one ear, watching carefully. At the clerk's desk, Aaron Feldman organized the docket sheets with trembling precision. He had confirmed the name twice before placing it on top of the stack. His normally methodical demeanor had been shaken. He knew the history. He had studied Judge Bennett's past rulings in law school. The courtroom doors closed with a firm sound as the bailiff announced, "All rise." Judge Richard Whitmore entered from the side chamber, black robe falling cleanly to his ankles. He walked with composed deliberation, though there was a tension in his shoulders that had not been present earlier in the morning. His face remained neutral, but his mind was anything but. Whitmore took his seat. Papers rustled as he began scanning the docket. Routine charges first, traffic violations, minor disturbances. Then his eyes settled on the next line. He froze. Defendant, Harold Bennett, age 85. For a moment the room seemed to tilt. Whitmore looked up slowly. Harold met his gaze without blinking. The judge's breath left him quietly. 30 years earlier he had sat at a smaller desk beneath this very man, absorbing lessons on restraint, on fairness, on constitutional clarity. He remembered Bennett's voice, firm but never theatrical. He remembered the standard Bennett had set. No one above scrutiny, no one beneath dignity. Whitmore removed his reading glasses and placed them carefully on the bench. "Bennett?" he said softly, almost to himself, then louder. "Defendant Harold Bennett?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Whitmore stood abruptly, an unusual departure from protocol, and descended the short steps from the bench. The black robe swayed slightly as he approached the defense position. Up close, the years were visible between them. "Sir," Whitmore said, voice controlled but edged with disbelief, "why are you standing there?" Harold's expression did not change. His eyes carried no anger, only clarity. "Perhaps," he replied gently, "you should ask the officers who brought me." The room inhaled as one. Daniel Brooks stiffened further. He had not anticipated recognition. The name had meant nothing to him during the stop. Now it echoed through the space with new weight. Stephen felt his stomach tighten. He recognized the shift in power dynamics instantly. Whitmore straightened, regaining formal composure. "Officers," he said evenly, turning toward them. "Step forward." Daniel obeyed, boots striking the floor in firm rhythm. "Your Honor, the defendant was observed in West Haven exhibiting suspicious behavior, circling the area repeatedly and refusing clear instructions." Whitmore's gaze remained steady. "Define suspicious." Daniel hesitated only briefly. Unfamiliar presence in a restricted residential zone. Evasive responses. Harold spoke quietly. "I provided identification and requested clarification of the legal basis for detention." Whitmore looked back at Daniel. "Was there a reported crime?" "No, Your Honor." "Was the defendant trespassing on private property?" "He was on public sidewalk adjacent to private residences." Whitmore absorbed the answer carefully. Claire Whitmore, from her seat, felt a flicker of internal conflict. She had moved to West Haven precisely because of its quiet insulation. She had appreciated the security. Yet hearing the exchange framed in legal terms unsettled her assumptions. Whitmore returned his focus to Harold. For a fraction of a second, the judge's formal demeanor softened into something personal. "You taught me," he said quietly enough that only those closest heard, "that constitutional protection is most tested at the margins." Harold's lips curved faintly. "And I meant it." The bailiff, an older man named Raymond Clark, with graying hair and a calm disposition shaped by decades of courtroom service, shifted his stance respectfully. Raymond had served under Harold years ago and recognized him immediately upon entry. He remained silent, but visibly attentive. Whitmore ascended back to the bench slowly, robe settling into place once more. The transformation from former clerk to presiding authority completed itself in a single, measured breath. The courtroom quieted completely. Whitmore addressed the room. The court recognizes Mr. Harold Bennett as a former federal judge of this district. Gasps, subdued but audible, traveled across the benches. Daniel's composure cracked for the briefest instant. Whitmore continued. However, titles are not relevant to the question before this court. His tone sharpened slightly. The question is whether lawful grounds existed for detention. Silence thickened. Harold remained motionless, hands still resting lightly before him. Whitmore looked directly at Daniel and Stephen. This court expects precision when liberty is restricted. The statement hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. No ruling had yet been issued, no gavel struck, but the imbalance had been exposed. In that stillness, the hierarchy of the room felt reversed, not through power, but through memory. Whitmore's final words of the session were measured. The court will review the report in detail. The murmurs returned, restrained but persistent. Harold Bennett stood exactly as he had entered, upright, dignified, composed. The courtroom, once noisy with speculation, now felt suspended in a different kind of silence, the kind that precedes reckoning, and every person present understood that what had begun as a routine suspicion in a uniform neighborhood had transformed into something far larger than a simple charge. The silence in the courtroom did not feel fragile anymore. It felt deliberate. Judge Richard Whitmore remained seated, hands folded before him, eyes steady but sharpened. The murmur that had rippled through the room after the recognition of Harold Bennett had now settled into something heavier. Anticipation. Officer Daniel Brooks stood upright, chin lifted slightly, but the firmness in his posture had lost its earlier certainty. Officer Stephen Cole kept his gaze forward, though a subtle tightening around his eyes betrayed discomfort. The fluorescent lights above seemed harsher now, illuminating every detail without mercy. Whitmore leaned slightly forward. "Officer Brooks," he began evenly, "state the legal basis for detaining Mr. Bennett." Daniel cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we suspected trespassing." Whitmore's voice remained controlled. "On what property?" He was in West Haven. "That is a residential development," Whitmore said, "not a private gated compound. Was he inside a fenced yard?" "No." "Was he attempting entry into any home?" "No, Your Honor." Whitmore's gaze did not waver. "Was he armed?" "No." "Did he threaten anyone?" "No." Stephen shifted slightly beside Daniel. His voice, when he spoke, was lower and less rigid. "We received a call reporting an unfamiliar individual walking repeatedly through the area." "Walking," Whitmore repeated. "On a public sidewalk." "Yes." "And when approached," Daniel answered quickly, "he questioned our authority." Harold's expression did not change. Whitmore's voice grew cooler. "Questioning authority is not unlawful." Daniel's composure thinned. "He refused to comply." Harold spoke quietly then, not raising his tone. "I asked for clarification. I provided identification." The courtroom air tightened. From the second row, Claire Whitmore watched Daniel closely. She noticed the shift, the difference between confidence and defensiveness. Claire had built her legal career on identifying moments where language concealed uncertainty. This was one of them. Judge Whitmore turned to Stephen. "Officer Cole, did Mr. Bennett physically resist?" Stephen hesitated for half a second too long. "No." "Did he attempt to flee?" "No." Whitmore paused, letting the silence stretch just enough to emphasize the absence of justification. Maya Thompson stood at the back of the courtroom, fingers curled tightly around a notebook she had not realized she was gripping. Her tall frame seemed almost fragile in that moment. Her eyes glistened, not from sentimentality but from the collision between theory and reality. She had studied constitutional protections in textbooks. Now she was watching them tested in real time. Harold Bennett stood without tremor. He did not interject further. He did not dramatize the moment. His restraint carried more weight than anger would have. Whitmore addressed the officers once more. "Suspicion requires articulable facts. What were those facts?" Daniel's voice faltered. "Unfamiliar presence, circling the area. That describes being lost." Whitmore replied evenly. The courtroom was silent again. Then Harold spoke, his voice calm, resonant without strain. "The law does not distinguish by color, Your Honor, but people sometimes do." The sentence was not accusatory. It was observational. The weight of it landed across every bench. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he did not respond. Stephen lowered his gaze briefly, absorbing the implication. Whitmore exhaled slowly. He remembered the first time he had watched Harold Bennett dismantle a flawed argument without raising his voice. Precision had always been Bennett's weapon. Now that precision was pointed gently but unmistakably at the system itself. Whitmore straightened in his chair. "This court finds no probable cause supporting the detention of Mr. Harold Bennett," he said clearly. The words moved through the room like a steady current. "All charges are dismissed." The gavel struck once, not loud, but final. For a moment, no one moved. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. The formal language of dismissal felt heavier than reprimand. Stephen nodded almost imperceptibly, accepting the outcome with a quiet humility that had grown since the patrol car ride. Harold inclined his head slightly, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. The tension did not explode into applause. It dissolved into something more complicated. Reflection. Claire Whitmore remained seated, thoughtful. She had moved to West Haven believing in its order and safety. Now she considered the cost of that insulation. She did not yet know what she would do with the awareness, but it had taken root. The bailiff, Raymond Clark, stepped forward gently to signal procedural closure. He met Harold's eyes briefly, with unmistakable respect. Harold turned to leave the defense position. His movements were measured, unhurried. Age had not diminished his steadiness. Behind him, Daniel and Stephen stood uncertainly, processing the shift from authority to scrutiny. At the back of the courtroom, Maya exhaled a breath she had been holding. She watched as Harold walked past her row. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met. He recognized her. There was no need for words. Maya's throat tightened. She felt not only relief, but responsibility. As the courtroom emptied gradually, she remained standing, thoughts racing. Thomas Gallagher approached quietly. "Not every lesson comes from textbooks," he said gently. Maya nodded. Later that afternoon, she sat at a small wooden desk in the courthouse library, sunlight filtering through tall windows. The room smelled faintly of old leather bindings. She opened her laptop and began drafting notes. She wrote not about Harold's identity as a former judge, but about the mechanics of suspicion, about how neighborhoods shape perception, about how authority must anchor itself to evidence. Her words flowed faster than she expected. She described the case without embellishment, careful to remain analytical rather than emotional. She examined the concept of reasonable suspicion and its vulnerability to bias. She questioned how privilege can create invisible borders in public spaces. Maya knew the article would not accuse individuals directly. Instead, it would examine structure, procedure, assumptions. She titled the draft, "Public Sidewalks and Private Perceptions." As she typed, she realized this was why she had entered law school, not for prestige but for clarity. Back in the now empty courtroom, Harold paused briefly near the doorway. He looked once more at the bench where he had once presided. A faint smile touched his lips, not of nostalgia, but of affirmation. Justice, he believed, is not self-sustaining. It must be practiced continuously. Officer Stephen Cole approached him hesitantly. "Sir," he said quietly. Harold turned. Stephen's posture was less guarded now. "I understand the ruling." Harold nodded. "Understanding is the beginning." Daniel remained several steps behind, silent. His expression was conflicted, pride wrestling with doubt. The dismissal had not felt like an attack, but it had unsettled something foundational in him. Harold did not lecture him. He simply walked past, hands resting lightly at his sides. The courthouse doors opened to the bright Charleston afternoon. The same city, the same streets. But something had shifted. The truth had not required anger. It had required exposure. And in the quiet after dismissal, that exposure lingered longer than accusation ever could. The courthouse steps emptied slowly under the afternoon sun. Charleston's air had grown warmer, the earlier coastal softness replaced by a steady southern brightness that cast long, sharp-edged shadows across the pavement. People dispersed in small clusters, lawyers returning to offices, interns whispering about what they had witnessed, officers retreating to cruisers. Inside the administrative wing of the police department, a brief but decisive instruction had already been issued. Captain Laura Mitchell, a woman in her early 50s with steel-gray hair pulled tightly into a low bun, had read the court's dismissal summary with careful attention. Mitchell was known within the department for her strict adherence to protocol. She was neither harsh nor lenient. She was methodical. Years earlier, an internal review case had nearly ended her career after a procedural oversight under her command escalated into public scrutiny. Since then, she had developed a deep intolerance for preventable errors. Her voice on the internal call had been calm. Officers Brooks and Cole will personally escort Mr. Bennett home. No further incident reports, no media statements. This concludes the matter. Daniel Brooks received the directive without outward reaction, though the muscles along his jaw tightened once more. He had replayed the courtroom exchange in his mind repeatedly since the dismissal. The word probable cause echoed uncomfortably. He had believed he was acting within caution. Now caution felt indistinguishable from presumption. Stephen Cole absorbed the order more quietly. For him, the dismissal had not felt like humiliation, but correction. There was weight in that distinction. They located Harold Bennett near the front entrance, where he stood beneath the courthouse awning, waiting not for transport, but simply taking in the afternoon air. He did not appear rushed. He did not appear burdened. "Sir," Stephen began gently, approaching him with visible restraint, "department protocol requires that we return you home." Harold regarded them both without hostility. Very well. No additional words were exchanged as they walked toward the patrol car. The ride through Charleston unfolded in silence. Traffic lights changed predictably. Storefronts passed in steady rhythm. The city appeared indifferent to what had occurred within its courthouse walls. Inside the vehicle, Daniel kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel. He drove with exact adherence to speed limits, signaling meticulously before each turn. Stephen sat beside him, eyes forward, posture composed but reflective. In the back seat, Harold rested upright once again, hands folded loosely. The same bench that had felt restrictive earlier now seemed merely temporary. His expression carried no trace of resentment, only contemplation. Daniel cleared his throat once, then reconsidered speaking. No one filled the silence. They turned off the main road and into the quieter residential stretch where Harold lived. His small wooden house came into view, blue shutters bright against the greenery of the modest garden. The roses he tended stood neatly trimmed along the walkway, evidence of deliberate care. Daniel parked at the curb. For a moment, no one moved. Stephen stepped out first and opened the rear passenger door. Harold emerged slowly but steadily, straightening once more to his full height. The afternoon light outlined his silver hair and steady profile. Daniel came around to face him directly. The younger officer's posture was no longer rigid. It had softened into something closer to humility. He removed his cap, a small gesture but intentional. "Sir," Daniel began, voice lower than before, "we were wrong." The words did not spill out easily. They were measured, deliberate. Stephen stood beside him, hands loosely clasped. "We misjudged the situation," he added quietly, "and we misjudged you." Harold studied their faces carefully. He saw no sarcasm, no defensiveness, only discomfort layered with awareness. Daniel continued, "We're sorry for how we treated you." Stephen's gaze dropped briefly before returning, "And for how that treatment reflects on others." The breeze moved lightly through the rose bushes. Harold did not respond immediately. He let the silence settle, not as punishment but as reflection. His eyes moved from Daniel to Stephen, weighing sincerity. "I have presided over thousands of cases," he said at last, voice calm and even. "I have seen criminals apologize because they were instructed to." Daniel swallowed faintly. "But I have also seen men recognize their own blind spots," Harold continued. "That recognition is the beginning of growth." The officers listened without interruption. "The greatest lesson I learned in 40 years on the bench," Harold said, "is that justice does not live exclusively in courtrooms. It lives in everyday decisions. Small ones. The moment you choose to question yourself instead of someone else." Daniel nodded slowly. Stephen held his gaze. Harold's expression softened just slightly. "Authority carries responsibility beyond procedure." A faint sound broke the stillness. A soft bark from the side yard. A golden retriever trotted into view through a partially open gate. The dog was elderly, its once bright coat now touched with white along the muzzle. Its name was Jasper. 13 years old, a companion Harold had adopted after his wife passed away 8 years earlier. Jasper moved with gentle stiffness but wagged his tail enthusiastically upon recognizing Harold. The officers watched as Harold bent carefully, age visible in the measured motion, to scratch the dog's head. "Consistency," Harold added quietly, "is what builds trust." Daniel looked toward the modest house and garden. The simplicity of Harold's life contrasted sharply with the assumptions that had framed the morning. "We'll do better," Stephen said. Harold straightened again. "That is your choice." There was no anger in his voice, no lecture beyond the necessary. Daniel replaced his cap slowly. "Thank you for hearing us." Harold inclined his head once. "Learn from it." The exchange ended without ceremony. The officers returned to the vehicle. Daniel paused briefly before entering, glancing once more at the small blue house and the elderly man standing beside his dog. He felt something unfamiliar, an awareness that authority without reflection could drift dangerously. Stephen closed his door gently. The patrol car pulled away. Harold remained on the sidewalk for several moments, Jasper at his side. The quiet of his neighborhood felt different from West Haven's engineered silence. Here, the air carried ordinary life. Distant laughter, a lawnmower humming somewhere down the block, wind brushing through trees unevenly spaced. He walked up the path to his front porch slowly, hand resting briefly on the railing. Inside, the house remained unchanged. Bookshelves lined with legal texts and history volumes. A framed photograph of his late wife smiling softly beside him. The kitchen table neatly arranged. The day had unfolded unexpectedly, but it had concluded with something rare. Acknowledgement. Across town, Captain Laura Mitchell received confirmation that the transport had been completed without incident. She closed the file deliberately. She understood that not all errors became scandals. Some became lessons, if taken seriously. In West Haven, Claire Whitmore stood by her living room window again, reflecting. She had watched a man taken away in handcuffs. Now she considered what she had not said in that moment. Reflection, she realized, could not remain passive. Back in his small house, Harold poured himself a glass of water and stood by the window, watching sunlight settle across his roses. He did not dwell on humiliation. He considered instead the quiet opportunity embedded in the apology. Justice had not required force. It had required humility, and that, he knew, was harder. Several weeks passed, and Charleston moved on in the quiet way cities do. News cycles shifted. Court dockets filled with new names. The humid edge of summer softened into early autumn, and the mornings regained a gentler clarity. Spanish moss swayed lazily in a cooler air, and sunlight stretched longer before the day claimed its heat. Harold Bennett resumed his routine. He had not rushed back into it. For several days after the incident, He chose to walk closer to home, along familiar streets where neighbors nodded in recognition. But discipline for Harold was not avoidance. It was consistency, and consistency required courage as much as it required habit. On this particular morning, the sky was a pale blue ribbon behind the oak branches. Harold tied his gray sneakers once more, adjusted the cuffs of his lightweight jacket, and stepped onto his front porch. Jasper, his aging golden retriever, remained curled on the rug inside. At 13, the dog no longer joined long walks. His hips had stiffened with time, but his loyalty had not dimmed. He watched Harold leave with calm, trusting eyes. Harold walked at a steady pace, shoulders upright, breathing controlled. He did not rush, nor did he hesitate. When he reached the intersection that once marked the beginning of his detour toward West Haven, he paused briefly, not out of fear but acknowledgement. Then he continued. He did not turn toward West Haven that morning. Instead, he traced a path that bordered its outer roads. It was close enough to symbolize intention, but not designed for confrontation. A patrol car moved slowly along the adjacent street. Inside, Officer Daniel Brooks adjusted his grip on the steering wheel as he recognized the tall, silver-haired figure walking along the sidewalk. The recognition was immediate. It carried no tension now, only awareness. Daniel had changed subtly in the weeks since the incident. His posture remained disciplined, but his gaze had softened. He had spent evenings reviewing departmental guidelines more carefully. He had requested additional training on community engagement, quietly, without announcement. Reflection had unsettled him, but it had also steadied him. He slowed the patrol car. For a brief moment, he considered driving past, preserving distance, but avoidance was no longer his instinct. He parked along the curb and stepped out. "Good morning, sir," Daniel called, voice measured but sincere. Harold stopped and turned. The early light caught the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. He regarded Daniel without surprise. "Good morning, officer," he replied calmly. There was no tension between them, no audience, no courtroom. Just two men standing on a Charleston sidewalk under a widening sky. Daniel removed his sunglasses and hooked them into the front of his uniform. It was a small gesture of openness. "Beautiful morning," he said. "It is," Harold agreed. For a moment, neither spoke further. The silence felt natural this time, not charged. Daniel nodded once. "I hope your walks have been peaceful." "They have," Harold said. "Peace often follows understanding." Daniel absorbed the statement quietly. He did not attempt to prolong the exchange. He did not seek validation. He simply inclined his head. "Take care, sir." "You as well, officer." Daniel returned to his vehicle and drove on. Harold resumed walking, his stride even, measured. The encounter had not erased what had happened weeks earlier, but it had transformed it. Across town, inside a small apartment near the university campus, Maya Thompson sat at her kitchen table surrounded by scattered legal journals. Her apartment was modest but meticulously organized. Books stacked by subject, not color, notes clipped neatly to corkboards. She wore comfortable slacks and a soft gray sweater. Her natural hair pulled into a loose bun as she reviewed her inbox. Her phone buzzed. An email notification appeared. She hesitated before opening it. The subject line read, "Federal Internship Program, Selection Notice." Her hands trembled slightly as she clicked. She read the first line twice. "Congratulations." The acceptance letter continued, referencing her recent analytical submission on procedural bias in public enforcement practices. Her article, Public Sidewalks and Private Perceptions, had circulated beyond her law school's internal journal. A federal clerk had cited it in a commentary piece. Her argument had been measured, structured, and grounded in legal principle rather than outrage. That had made it persuasive. Maya exhaled sharply, covering her mouth in disbelief. The apartment felt suddenly too small to contain her relief. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street below. The world looked unchanged, yet something inside her had shifted. Her phone buzzed again, this time a text from Thomas Gallagher. "Heard the news, you earned it." Maya smiled faintly. She thought of Harold Bennett, not as a symbol but as a standard. She resolved to carry that standard forward. Back in his neighborhood, Harold completed his walk and returned home. The roses in his small garden had begun to bloom again after a careful pruning. Their deep red petals stood vibrant against green leaves. He paused at the gate and rested his hand lightly on the fence. He had once entered courtrooms through side doors reserved for judges. He had once worn robes that signaled authority before he spoke a word. Now he stood in a modest yard in Charleston, simply an elderly man returning from a walk. And yet, nothing about the simplicity diminished him. Justice, he understood more clearly than ever, did not belong exclusively to titles or benches. It belonged to behavior, to choices, to how one responded when unseen. He bent slightly to trim a stray stem from one of the rose bushes. His movements were deliberate, patient. The sun rose higher, casting warmth across the yard. Inside the house, Jasper lifted his head at the sound of the gate closing, tail thumping gently against the floor. Harold stood upright once more and looked eastward as the morning brightened. He had once sat above others in a courtroom. Today he stood on equal ground, and in that equality he felt something steady and intact. He was no longer a presiding judge, he was simply a man walking beneath an open sky. But justice walked with him. This story is not only about an elderly man, 2 officers, or a courtroom. It is about the quiet moments in everyday life when we decide who deserves dignity and who does not. Harold Bennett did not win because of his former title. He did not win because he raised his voice. He stood firm because he knew who he was and what the law truly meant. His strength was not in authority, but in integrity. That is a lesson for all of us. In daily life, we meet strangers we do not understand. We see people who look different from us. We step into neighborhoods, workplaces, schools, and public spaces where assumptions are made in seconds. The real question is not who holds power. The real question is how we use it. Authority without humility becomes arrogance. Security without compassion becomes discrimination. And silence in the face of unfairness slowly normalizes it. Education is not only found in classrooms, it is found in reflection, in pausing before reacting, in asking ourselves whether our judgment is based on facts or fear. Every small decision we make shapes the culture we live in. This story teaches us that justice is not abstract. It is personal. It lives in how we treat the elderly, how we respond to strangers, how we speak to those who question us. It lives in whether we choose empathy over assumption. If you are a parent, teach your children that dignity is not selective. If you are a leader, remember that leadership is service. If you are in uniform, remember that authority must protect, not intimidate. If you are simply walking through life, remember that someone else may be walking through their own unseen battle. We cannot end discrimination with anger alone. We end it with awareness, accountability, and courage to change. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling us what part touched you most. Where are you watching from today? Subscribe to this channel if you believe stories can change hearts. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next message about justice, character, and faith. May God bless everyone watching. May He guide our decisions, soften our judgments, and strengthen our integrity. If you believe that dignity belongs to every human being, write Amen in the comments and stand for justice in your everyday life.